Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into rent control,
Ooh.
specifically in San Francisco.
Okay.
Um,
Seems
and
fascinating.
yeah, it is. We have some excerpts from this 2019 research paper from the American Economic Review.
Okay.
It's called The Effects of Rent Control Expansion on Tenants, Landlords, and Inequality. Evidence from San Francisco.
Catchy.
Yeah, very catchy, but the paper itself is super interesting.
Okay.
And it dives into this major rent control expansion that happened back in 1994.
Right. Right.
San Francisco has long been a battleground, for housing affordability.
Oh, yeah.
And even back in the 70s, they had rent control, but it only applied to larger apartment buildings. And then in 1994, they decided to kind of shake things up and extend rent control to these smaller multifamily buildings built before 1980.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so you can imagine, picture this, right? You're living in San Francisco in 1994,
Okay.
and all of a sudden your building becomes subject to rent control.
Yeah.
But, right next door...
Right. Is like an almost identical building
Wow.
that was built just a year later.
Yeah.
And those tenants, they aren't covered.
That's wild.
I know. So this created this perfect natural experiment for researchers.
Oh, okay.
Right. Because it allowed them to isolate the true cause and effect of the policy change.
Yeah, like a real-world A/B test almost.
Exactly. Exactly. It's like a real-life A/B test for rent control.
That's a great way to put it.
So this type of research design, is super valuable because it helps us move beyond just simple correlations.
Right.
And we can get closer to understanding the actual impact of rent control.
Yeah, not just what seems related, but what actually is
Exactly.
cause and effect.
Exactly. So what did they find? Well, the results are pretty fascinating,
Okay.
especially for tenants.
Okay.
So the study found that rent control, it really did help tenants stay in their apartments.
Okay.
If your apartment was rent controlled, you were something like 10 to 20% more likely to still be living there
Well,
compared to someone in a similar non-rent controlled unit.
that's significant.
Yeah, it is. And it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
So not only did rent control help people stay in their specific apartments, it also helped them stay in San Francisco, altogether.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so the research suggests that a big chunk of those who stayed in their apartments because of rent control,
Yeah.
they would have otherwise just left the city entirely
Interesting.
due to, those rising housing costs.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so essentially rent control was acting as this buffer against displacement, especially when market rents were shooting up.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, so for those tenants at least, it seems like rent control was this win.
Right.
It offered them stability and protection from being displaced.
Yeah.
But as you might expect, there's another side to this story.
Okay.
The landlords.
Of course.
So landlords,
They don't just sit back.
right. They had to adapt to these new rules.
Yeah.
And their responses, they really had a ripple effect throughout the city's housing market.
I bet.
So let's talk about those landlord responses.
Yeah.
What did they actually do to kind of navigate this new rent control landscape?
Right.
Did they just raise rents on their non-rent controlled units to compensate?
Well, some probably did, I imagine.
Yeah.
But a lot of them got a little more creative.
Okay.
They used a couple of key strategies like condo conversions
Okay.
and redevelopments.
Okay.
So they realized that if they turned their rental buildings into owner-occupied units,
Mm-hmm.
they could basically just sidestep those rent control regulations altogether.
Yeah. Yeah. Condo conversions make sense.
Yeah.
But what about redevelopments? How did those play into it?
Well, you see the 1994 rent control expansion.
Yeah.
It only applied to buildings built before 1980.
Oh, okay.
So some landlords decided to just tear down those older buildings
Wow.
and construct brand new ones,
Mhm.
which would then be exempt from rent control.
Oh, that's a smart way to
Work around it.
work around it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So landlords are finding ways to remove their properties from that pool of rent controlled units.
Yeah.
That must have had a pretty big impact on the overall supply of, affordable housing in San Francisco.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The research actually found that there was a 15% decrease
Wow.
in the supply of rental housing.
15.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
In the category impacted by the rent control expansion. Yeah.
Wow. So when you have fewer units available
Yeah.
in a city where everyone wants to live,
Right.
what happens?
Basic economics tells us that when supply goes down,
Yeah.
and demand stays strong,
Correct.
prices go up.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened in San Francisco.
Of course.
Yeah. So the study suggests that this decrease in rental housing supply actually contributed to higher market rents in the long run.
So, like, ironically, rent control, which was meant to make housing more affordable,
Right.
maybe actually made the problem worse.
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah, the unintended consequence.
Unintended consequences, exactly.
And the irony doesn't stop there.
Oh,
The research also found a link between rent control
okay.
and gentrification.
That's a hot button issue.
Yeah.
I've heard that rent control can fuel it.
Yeah. So how did the study support that idea?
Well, you remember all those new condos?
Yeah.
Redeveloped buildings
Yeah.
that were exempt from rent control?
Yeah.
They tended to attract, like, higher income residents.
Right.
So while rent control was helping some lower income, longer term tenants stay put,
Mm-hmm.
it was also creating these opportunities for wealthier residents to move into these newly developed, more expensive units.
It's almost like a double-edged sword,
It is, yeah.
right? Helping some residents stay in their homes, but then potentially pushing others out due to rising costs.
It's complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a lot to unpack here.
For sure.
But before we jump into, like, the ethical considerations, okay, let's take a closer look at how those landlords were adapting to rent control.
Okay.
Like, the study revealed some pretty fascinating tactics
Okay.
that they used beyond just those condo conversions and redevelopments.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, so the researchers found that landlords of rent-controlled properties,
Okay.
they were much more likely to take out permits for major renovations
Oh, interesting.
compared to landlords of similar buildings that weren't subject to rent control.
Huh.
So it makes you wonder, like, what was their motivation? Were
Right.
they just trying to, like, spruce up their properties to justify, like, higher rents down the line?
Well, that's possible.
Yeah.
But there's another possible explanation
Okay.
that kind of ties back to those condo conversions.
Okay.
So in San Francisco, if you do, like, substantial renovations to a unit,
Yeah.
you can actually reset the rent to market rate,
Oh, wow.
even if the building is under rent control.
So it was, like, a way for them to, like,
yeah.
gradually chip away at
Yeah,
the rent
right.
control restrictions.
Yep.
And increase their profits over time.
That's right.
It's like it's like they're playing a game,
Oh, yeah.
It's
strategic.
both sides, trying to adapt and make the best moves
For sure.
for their own interests.
High stakes, too.
Yeah.
People's homes and livelihoods
Exactly.
hanging in the balance.
That's a lot.
It is. It's a lot.
So it seems like, rent control, it did have some positive effects for certain tenants,
Right.
especially, those who were already living in those rent-controlled units.
Right. Right.
But it also created some unintended consequences,
Yeah.
like potentially driving up market rents and even contributing to gentrification.
Yeah, the classic example of a policy meant to solve one problem,
Right.
but maybe creating new ones.
Right. And it underscores, the importance of careful consideration
Absolutely.
and really thorough research
Yeah,
when we're thinking about implementing these types of regulations.
for sure.
There are just no easy answers when it comes to housing affordability. So complex.
Yeah, it's so complex.
So many factors.
But this research, at least, it gives us a deeper understanding of
Yeah.
the complexities
For sure.
and the potential trade-offs
Absolutely.
that we need to consider.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely a lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
But we've uncovered some pretty surprising insights, I think, about, the effects of rent control in San Francisco.
Yeah, definitely.
But there's still more to explore.
Okay.
We haven't even touched on the specific impacts on, like, different racial groups,
Right?
which is, a crucial part of this story.
Yeah, absolutely.
So stay tuned, because in the next part of our deep dive,
Okay.
we'll be examining how that rent control expansion played out for different racial and ethnic communities in San Francisco.
Sounds good.
It's a fascinating and, nuanced part of this story that you won't want to miss.
Can't wait.
All right, so welcome back.
Back again.
We've seen how that 1994 rent control expansion in San Francisco.
Played out for tenants and landlords.
Yeah.
But as we kind of hinted at before, there's another layer to this whole story.
Right.
The impact on different racial and ethnic groups.
Right. Yeah, this is where the research gets really interesting.
Okay.
It goes beyond just like the overall effects of rent control
Mm-hmm.
and digs into how the policy affected different communities.
Yeah, and what did they find? Like, was the impact pretty much the same across the board? Or were there, like, significant differences based on race and ethnicity?
Well, The findings suggest that, the benefits of rent control weren't evenly distributed.
Okay.
In fact, the study revealed this pretty striking disparity
Oh, wow.
in how the policy impacted Black and Hispanic renters
Okay.
compared to their white counterparts.
So there were notable racial disparities in terms of who benefited most from rent control.
Yeah, that's right.
Huh. That's not something you hear every day.
No, not really.
Tell me more.
So the research found that Black and Hispanic renters, they experienced the greatest gains in terms of both staying in their homes and remaining in San Francisco.
Wow.
Like they were significantly more likely to stay put compared to white renters
Okay.
who were facing similar market pressures.
That's a pretty powerful finding.
It is.
It suggests that rent control might have played a crucial role in, preventing displacement
Yeah.
among these communities
Exactly.
who often face, greater challenges when it comes to housing affordability and stability.
For sure. It definitely points in that direction.
Yeah.
And it raises some interesting questions about, the potential for rent control to address historical inequities
Oh,
in
good.
housing access.
So while rent control might have, unintentionally fueled gentrification
Right.
and driven up market rents overall,
Yeah.
it seems like it also provided a much-needed safety net
Yeah, it did.
for some of the city's most vulnerable residents.
Right. It's a nuanced perspective, but I think it's an important one to acknowledge.
Yeah,
The impacts of rent control are, they're complex, they're multifaceted.
totally.
It's not a simple black and white issue.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing that.
Yeah.
This research is painting a much more intricate picture than just, the typical talking points you hear about rent control.
I agree.
It's not just good or bad. It's like this mix of intended and unintended consequences that play out differently for different groups of people.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to really delve into the data
Yeah.
and understand the nuances
Right.
rather than just relying on, simplistic assumptions or generalizations.
Well said. Now, I remember there was one more fascinating detail from the study that I kind of wanted to dig into a little bit.
Yeah.
It had to do with the specific types of neighborhoods
Okay.
where rent-controlled tenants ended up living.
Right. The neighborhood dynamics.
Yeah.
This is where we start to see how those strategic decisions of landlords,
Mm-hmm.
combined with the effects of rent control, can really influence the distribution of residents across the city.
Yeah, so the study found that compared to similar renters not covered by rent control,
Yeah.
those in rent-controlled units were more likely to be living in neighborhoods with lower average incomes,
Right.
fewer, desirable amenities,
Yeah.
and higher unemployment rates.
Yeah, that's right. And this finding really sheds light on the strategies landlords were using
Okay.
to maximize their profits in a rent-controlled environment.
So it wasn't just about those condo conversions and redevelopments. It
Oh.
seems like landlords in those more desirable high demand neighborhoods, they were actively trying to get rent controlled tenants out of their units,
Yeah.
even if it meant resorting to tactics like buyouts
Right.
or finding loopholes in the regulation.
Exactly. Remember, landlords, they're running businesses.
Yeah,
They're going to try to optimize their returns.
right.
And in those high-demand areas, it often just made more financial sense to get those rent-controlled tenants out, even if it required, some maneuvering.
Mm-hmm.
So they could either rent the units at the higher market rate
Okay.
or convert them into those more profitable condos.
It kind of paints a complicated picture,
It does.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
Rent control might help you stay in San Francisco,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily guarantee you access to the most desirable neighborhoods
Yeah.
or housing options.
It's true.
And it further underscores that complex interplay between
Yeah.
policy intentions
Yeah.
and real world outcomes.
It's really interesting. We
Yeah.
see how rent control, while aiming to protect tenants, can inadvertently lead to these shifts in neighborhood demographics
Right.
and potentially limit choices.
Yeah.
For those very tenants it's designed to help.
This deep dive is really making me rethink some of my assumptions about rent control.
Mhm.
It's clearly a much more nuanced issue than I initially realized.
Yeah, I think that's a common experience for anyone who, digs beneath the surface of this topic. It's a reminder that there are rarely easy answers
Right.
when it comes to, complex policy challenges,
Yeah.
especially in the realm of housing.
So what can we take away from all this? If rent control has both positive and negative effects,
Yeah.
how do we weigh those trade-offs and make informed decisions about housing policy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right.
And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah.
Each city has its own unique,
Right.
housing market, demographics, political climate.
Right.
What works in San Francisco might not work in another city.
Yeah.
And even within a single city, the impacts of rent control can vary widely depending on the specific regulations
Okay.
and the responses of landlords and tenants.
So it sounds like the key takeaway is we need to approach these issues with a nuanced and data-driven perspective.
Absolutely.
We can't rely on, simplistic assumptions or generalizations.
For sure. We need to be willing to dig into the research,
Yeah.
understand the complexities, and consider the potential trade-offs.
Right.
And just as importantly, I think, we need to recognize that the conversation about housing policy,
Yeah.
it's an ongoing one.
It is. It's always evolving.
It requires constant evaluation, adaptation, and a willingness to, learn from both successes and failures.
I think that's a great place to, pause for now.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the initial impacts of the rent control expansion
Right.
to the long-term consequences for both tenants and landlords.
Yeah.
We've even explored the disparities in how different racial groups were affected
Uh-huh.
and how those landlord strategies played a role in shaping neighborhood dynamics.
Absolutely.
But there's still one more, crucial aspect of this research we need to discuss:
Okay.
how those landlords adapted to the,
Right.
challenges and opportunities presented by rent control,
Yeah.
and how their strategies really influenced the city's housing landscape.
That's right. Their responses weren't just a passive reaction to rent control.
Right.
They were an active force
Yeah.
shaping the evolution of San Francisco's housing market.
Wow.
And those adaptations they had ripple effects throughout the city,
Okay.
impacting not just the economics of housing,
Uh,
but the social fabric of neighborhoods.
it sounds like we're about to uncover even more layers of complexity in this already fascinating deep dive into San Francisco's rent control saga.
Oh, yeah. Buckle up.
Welcome back to our deep dive. We're going to be wrapping up our exploration of rent control in San Francisco,
Right.
and we're finally getting to the landlords' side of the story.
Okay.
How they adapted to this whole new world of rent control.
Yeah. Landlords,
Yeah.
they're often portrayed as these monolithic entities.
Right.
But in reality,
Yeah.
they're individuals, businesses making decisions
Uh-huh.
in this complex system.
Right. It's not so simple.
It's not. And their responses to rent control they were anything but uniform.
Okay, so let's get into those responses.
Yeah.
We've talked about condo conversions, redevelopments,
Right.
pretty dramatic moves.
Yeah.
But the research also pointed out some more subtle yet still impactful strategies they use to navigate this rent control world.
For sure.
One of the most interesting findings was just the sheer number of renovations
Yeah.
that were happening in rent-controlled buildings. Landlords were way more likely to invest in these major renovations if their properties were under rent control.
So it makes you wonder,
Yeah.
were these renovations really about improving the quality of the units?
Right.
Or was there a more strategic motive?
Yeah, exactly. I
Yeah.
mean, were they just trying to spruce things up
Yeah.
to justify higher rents down the line?
Well, some renovations.
Yeah.
There were probably genuine improvements.
Right.
But the research, I think, suggests that a lot of them
Yeah.
were driven by a financial incentive.
Okay.
So you see, in San Francisco,
Yeah.
if you do substantial renovations to a unit,
Uh-huh.
you can actually reset the rent to market rate,
Wow.
even if that building is under rent control.
So it's a way for them to...
Yeah, it's a loophole.
A loophole, yeah.
A way to sidestep the restrictions
And increase their profit.
increase their profits over time. Exactly.
That's clever.
Yeah, it's clever.
It's clever.
It highlights how,
Yeah.
savvy landlords can be
Right.
in adapting to these changing regulations.
Right. They're always going to be looking for an angle.
They are. They're looking for ways to optimize their returns.
Right.
And rent control, it's both a challenge and an opportunity.
It's like this cat and mouse game.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, policymakers trying to protect tenants
Right.
and landlords trying to maintain their profitability.
Yeah. It's fascinating how this played out.
It is. It's
Yeah.
a fascinating case study.
Rent control created this like whole ecosystem of
Yeah.
strategic decisions and unintended consequences.
And it reminds us that,
Yeah.
policy interventions, no matter how well-intentioned,
Right.
they often have these ripple effects
Yeah.
that extend far beyond their initial targets.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener?
Yeah, good question.
Well, if you live in a city with rent control,
Uh-huh.
this research offers some like really valuable insights
Right.
into these complex dynamics at play.
Yeah, it's a reminder that rent control,
Yeah.
it's not a simple solution to
Right.
housing affordability.
The more complicated.
It's a complex policy with,
Yeah.
benefits,
Yeah.
drawbacks,
Right.
and its effectiveness can vary greatly.
Yeah. Depending on how it's implemented.
Depending on the specific regulations,
yeah.
the responses of landlords,
Uh-huh.
tenants.
Yeah. This deep dive has really shown us that even these like seemingly straightforward policies,
Right.
they can have unintended consequences.
They can.
And when it comes to something as,
It's not
essential as
fun.
housing,
As housing.
Yeah. I mean, those consequences can have a profound impact on people's lives.
That's right. And it's a powerful reminder
Yeah.
that we need to be thoughtful, data-driven,
Yeah.
and constantly evaluating
Yeah.
the impacts of our policies.
Yeah. And I think,
Actually,
I mean, most importantly,
Yeah,
we need to approach these challenges with empathy
absolutely.
and recognizing that, everyone deserves
Yeah,
safe, stable, and affordable housing.
well said.
We've covered a lot of ground today,
A lot of ground.
but I think the conversation is
Yeah.
far from over.
It's just the beginning, really.
Yeah. This research raises, I think, more questions than it answers.
It does, and that's good.
Yeah. It challenges us to keep learning.
Keep questioning
Keep questioning.
and keep striving for solutions
Yeah.
that create a more just and equitable housing landscape for everyone.
I think that's a great note to end on.
It is.
So as you go about your day, we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues.
Yeah.
Engage in those conversations.
Have those tough conversations.
Yeah. And maybe even do a little exploring of your own.
Yeah, for sure.
What are the housing challenges in your community?
Right. What policies are being debated?
Yeah. And what role can you play
Yeah.
in shaping a better future for everyone? Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
We'll see you next time.